The bar Adam and I walked into that evening breathed an air of the past. Wooden paneling, patinated brass on the counter, and the warm glow of candle-shaped lamps. This little corner seemed frozen somewhere in the 70s, which is why it always felt to me like time stopped here. But this time, instead of sinking into cozy nostalgia, I felt empty. Adam silently scrolled through his phone, barely noticing my gaze. I recognized that work look of his, the one he wore when he was searching for an excuse to avoid conversation. Several times I tried to strike up a discussion, but Adam's replies were sparse, as if words themselves were a burden. Ordinary topics seemed dull to him, and my attempts to delve into something deeper felt unwelcome. I stared at our glasses. His beer, my wine. They sat close together, yet between us there was too much silence. With every passing second, the silence grew heavier, like a snowball rolling downhill, turning into a booming echo in my heart. What's happening to us? I wanted to ask, but the words got stuck. Maybe because I knew he wouldn't have an answer anyway. At some point, I allowed myself to look around. Laughter at a nearby table, light-hearted jokes exchanged by strangers at the counter. All of it seemed so distant. It was as if I was watching a different life, one we no longer belonged to. When did we become these people? Quiet, detached, estranged? It's stuffy in here, Adam said without lifting his eyes. He looked tired and irritated, as though simply being here was a burden to him. I nodded, though I didn't feel the stuffiness myself. The stifling sensation was inside, where a painful realization was growing. We were like two people lost in a labyrinth, and neither of us knew the way out. We finished our drinks and stepped outside. The air was fresh, but instead of relief, I felt a wave of loneliness wash over me. We walked in silence, each absorbed in our own thoughts. I tried to figure out what had broken in our relationship and whether it could be fixed. But at that moment, in the cold of the night city, I felt only one thing: emptiness. The following Saturday, we were driving to Adam's parents' house for a family dinner. The highway stretched endlessly, and the monotonous hum of the car was almost lulling. We hardly spoke, aside from the occasional, "How much longer?" or "Should we put on some music?" When the engine suddenly stalled, it was like an unexpected jolt. Silence gave way to the need for action. Adam cursed and slapped the steering wheel, as if that would somehow bring the car back to life. But nothing happened. We pulled over to the side of the road, and he began dialing Vince. Vince, Adam's stepbrother. A complicated man with an easy smile and sharp, bright eyes who always managed to turn any situation to his advantage. I hadn't seen him in a long time. He lived far away, as if fleeing from his past. But now, in this situation, he was our only hope. He arrived about an hour later, driving an old truck, winking as he stepped out of the vehicle, and immediately set to work under the hood. I watched him as he deftly handled the tools, his movements fluid and confident. He was one of those people who always seemed at ease, no matter the circumstances. "Something's off with this engine," he muttered without looking up. "Wrong oil, probably. Gotta treat it carefully, like life." His voice carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I couldn't help but smile slightly. His words, though playful, felt unusually sincere. Adam stood nearby with his arms crossed, his expression stony. Perhaps he didn't like how quickly Vince had taken control of the situation. Half an hour later, the car roared back to life. Vince slammed the hood shut, wiped his hands with a rag, and walked over to me. "All set. You're lucky to have Adam. He doesn't leave people stranded," he said, his words directed at me, though his gaze lingered just a fraction too long to be purely casual. "Thank you," I replied softly, feeling something stir inside in response to that look. It wasn't romantic, nor was it attraction. More like a spark. A genuine sense of intrigue. As we set off again, Adam behind the wheel, I found myself drifting back to thoughts of Vince. His ease, his words, His ability to talk about simple things with such warmth. All of it stood in stark contrast to the tension that had been suffocating my relationship with Adam for so long. Adam's parents' house was just as I remembered it. The smell of freshly baked goods, warm brown tones in the decor, and an old rug with faint stains from childhood mischief. But that evening, it failed to bring me its usual comfort. Adam and I barely exchanged words, and despite the family smiles and questions, his emotional distance was palpable. After dinner, when everyone moved to the living room, Vince found himself beside me at the kitchen table. He held a cup of coffee, but it seemed like he was just waiting for the right moment to start a conversation. "Long day, huh?" he began. His voice was soft, calm, almost as if he could read my mind. "You have no idea," I sighed. He leaned in slightly, as if he had something important to share. "You've always been a dreamer, haven't you?" he asked, catching me off guard. I was taken aback. The question was so direct, I held my breath for a moment. Why was he asking? How did he seem to see deeper into me than he should? "I guess I used to be," I replied hesitantly. "And you?" "All the time," he said with a smile. "The difference is I sometimes let myself follow those dreams, no matter the risk." "What about you?" The question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. What could I say? That I hadn't dared to do anything new in a long time? That my fear of making mistakes had grown stronger than my desire to change something? Vince took a small sip of coffee and, as if unaware of my discomfort, continued. "You know what I love most about traveling? That moment when you find yourself in a new place and suddenly you realize how much is still ahead. Even when things go wrong, it's better than standing still." I listened, and his words cut deep into my consciousness like a sharp blade. Why did they feel so familiar? Maybe because I'd been feeling like I was stuck in one place for so long. In the other room, Adam was sitting with his father, engrossed in discussing some household matters. I glanced at him briefly. Behind all the lack of connection, the way he avoided my questions in recent weeks, the silence, was there anything more? Or was this all we had left? "You look like someone who's forgotten what it means to be yourself," Vince said, not waiting for my answer. "Sorry if I'm overstepping, but sometimes all we need is a reminder." He got up to leave, leaving me alone with his words. A reminder of who I used to be, of what I once wanted. His words lingered in my mind, like song lyrics that refused to let go. I noticed Adam glance briefly in our direction before looking away again. He didn't seem to care. Or maybe he just didn't want to notice. That night, I felt the familiar restlessness inside me once more, a feeling that had become a constant part of me, but now it refused to stay silent. The next morning, Adam's parents' house was filled with its usual noises, the clinking of dishes, the low murmur of a TV host narrating some program, and muffled conversations from neighboring rooms. Adam, as always, seemed calm but distant. He busied himself with household chores, helping his mother, barely acknowledging my presence. It had become routine. I was sitting on the porch, warming my hands on a cup of coffee, when Vince stepped out of the house, pulling a jacket over his t-shirt. His presence always seemed so natural, as if he could seamlessly fit into any moment or space. He smiled and nodded toward the driveway. "Got any plans today?" he asked casually, as though he already knew the answer. "Not yet," I replied honestly. "Come with me to the market? I need to pick up a few things for some projects, but it's boring going alone. Besides, you seem like you could use a simple walk." I hesitated, but only for a second. Something inside me suggested I should say yes. Once, I might have thought it inappropriate to go off with Vince instead of staying with Adam. But now, Adam probably wouldn't even notice I was gone. We drove along a winding road in Vince's old truck, and I felt strangely free, as if someone had temporarily lifted invisible chains off me. Vince talked about his return to the city, about wanting to find something stable here while still keeping his sense of adventure. His words were light, but I sensed a deeper meaning behind them. He was searching for himself. When we arrived at the market, it was bursting with life, smells, and sounds. Fresh bread, spices, the hum of conversation, and children's laughter filled the space, making it feel vividly alive. Vince moved confidently through the crowd, striking up conversations with vendors, joking with shoppers, and even offering me a bite of cheese from an old farmer who seemed to know him well. "It's nice here, isn't it?" he asked as we stopped at a stall selling homemade pies. "Yeah," I said, inhaling the aroma of freshly baked goods. I can't remember the last time I came to a market. It's always something. Work. Chores. Vince turned to me, his gaze more serious now. "Do you say that a lot? Work? Chores? Time? What about your own wants? You weren't always like this." I felt a tightness in my chest. Once again, his question hit too close to home. How did he know what this felt like? How could he see what I was afraid to admit to myself? We continued walking, talking about everything. Favorite foods, places he'd visited. He spoke about nights spent in small towns where the air smelled of the sea and the people he'd met along the way. "You know what's interesting?" he said. "Most people live as if they have all the time in the world to chase their dreams. But sometimes you need to take a risk right now. We never really know how much time we have." Those words, simple and obvious, hit me with unexpected force. I thought of all the plans and dreams that had once seemed so vivid. When had they faded into pale shadows? On the way home, I realized how quickly time had passed with Vince, as though the market, its bustling life, and his stories had transported me to another world. As we drove, he said something else that stayed with me. "Sometimes you just need to believe there's another path. It might be hard, but it's better than staying somewhere you no longer feel alive." Those words echoed in my mind as I stared out the window, watching the fields blur past. I knew this conversation was more than just a casual exchange. It was a challenge to myself that I could no longer ignore. That evening, Adam and I decided to go grocery shopping. It was his idea, but even in such small gestures, it was clear he was merely going through the motions. The supermarket, its bright shelves stocked with goods, and the lines at the checkout were all familiar, yet everything about it annoyed me more than usual this time. It felt like a mirror reflecting our routine, one I didn't know how to escape. We slowly moved down the aisles. Adam walked ahead, tossing the usual items into the cart. Bread, milk, boxes of juice. No changes, nothing new. Just like our lives. "Maybe we try something different," I suggested, stopping at a shelf of exotic sauces. "You like Asian food, and we haven't cooked anything like that in ages." He didn't even glance my way, just shook his head. "We've got everything we need at home. You're always trying to complicate things that could be simple," he said curtly. The words struck like a whip. Not the content, but the tone. Devoid of interest, of any desire to engage, filled only with irritation he didn't bother to hide. It wasn't the first time he'd responded like this, but today, something inside me snapped. "Seriously, Adam?" I felt my voice tremble with restrained anger. "Complicate things? Do you even hear how you talk to me? You're so wrapped up in your own world that you don't even notice how everything between us is falling apart." He stopped, turned abruptly to face me. His expression was tense, but there was no anger or regret in his eyes. Just exhaustion. "Falling apart?" he repeated, as if hearing the words for the first time. "You're the one building problems in your head and blaming me for not fixing them. Maybe the problem isn't me." Those words enraged me more than I'd expected. How could he not see the obvious? How could we live side by side, sharing a life, and yet he was so disconnected from me? "You know what's the saddest part?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I feel like you've been gone for a long time. You're just here, living next to me, but we're strangers. And I'm tired of pretending that's okay." Adam turned away as if my voice had become noise he wanted to block out. He ran a hand through his hair, took a step toward the next aisle, and said nothing more. I stood there, gripping the cart handle, feeling my insides churn. That silent retreat said more than words ever could. He didn't want to deal with this. It was easier for him to shut down, to retreat into himself, than to even try to hear me. The rest of the shopping trip passed in oppressive silence. We moved through the aisles together, but might as well have been on separate planets. At the checkout, I felt the weight of a growing chasm between us, a divide that now seemed impossible to bridge. On the drive home, I stared out the window, unwilling to speak. Vince's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes you just need to believe there's another path. But was there another path now? Or was I simply trying to run from the problem? When we got home, Adam silently went to the bedroom without even looking at me. I stayed in the kitchen, unpacking groceries, feeling a new wave of loneliness wash over me. The quiet of the house pressed down on me, and for the first time in a long while, I realized just how deeply I had been sinking into this emptiness. The night was restless. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Adam's words at the supermarket still echoed in my ears, like a wound that hadn't healed properly. His irritation, his indifference. It all deepened the hollow emptiness inside me. I tried convincing myself that I needed to fight for our relationship, but something deep within whispered the opposite. A soft knock at my door startled me. "Come in," I said, unsure who it could be. The door creaked open, and Vince appeared in the doorway. He looked calm, but there was a thoughtful expression on his face, as if he'd been debating whether or not to come. "You're awake," he said, more a statement than a question. "No," I replied, sitting up and rubbing my temples. "Too many thoughts." He nodded and stepped into the room, settling into the armchair in the corner with a surprising ease. For a while, we sat in silence. It was a strangely comfortable silence, as if he instinctively knew not to rush me. "You look exhausted," he finally said, breaking the stillness. "Something wrong?" I let out a dry laugh, bitter and sharp. "Everything's wrong, Vince. I can't remember the last time I felt alive. Adam and I are like two roommates who share an apartment but barely talk. I don't even know how it got this bad." Vince leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze was gentle but serious. "Do you think it's over?" he asked. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it's fixable, but most of the time, I just want to run away." Vince shook his head. "It's not wrong to leave a life that feels like it's suffocating you. Leaving isn't always running away. It can be a way to find yourself. But tell me honestly, do you even know what you want?" His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. Something inside twisted painfully, as if he had just said aloud what I'd been too afraid to admit. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I knew what I wanted, but I couldn't. It would have been a lie. "You're right," I whispered, clenching my fists. I don't know. I don't know what I want. I don't know what to do." Vince stood and approached the bed, sitting down lightly on its edge. His voice dropped to a near whisper, intimate and sincere. "Do you know why I came back here? It wasn't just for a new house or a job. I was searching for a new purpose. Something that would make life feel meaningful again. Sometimes we forget that happiness isn't a destination. It's the path we choose to walk." I stared at him, unable to look away. His words dug so deep I couldn't ignore them. He was talking about himself, but it felt like he was speaking directly to my soul. Everything I was feeling, it seemed he had already lived through. "You can find it," he continued. "But first, you have to decide what matters more. Stability that doesn't bring you joy, or the risk that could change everything." He stood, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary before heading to the door. "If you need anything, I'm here," he said before leaving me alone in the quiet. I sat there, his words still echoing in my mind. Words about choices, about paths, about seeking happiness. But did I have the courage to make that choice? Or was I too scared to step off the path I already knew, even if it was leading me nowhere? The next day, I barely saw Adam. He was busy with his father, helping fix something in the shed, and barely noticed me even when we happened to be in the same room. I still felt the tension from our argument, but I had neither the energy nor the desire to continue the conversation. All I could do was wait for the day to pass. By lunchtime, Vince found me in the kitchen. He held a map of local trails in his hands, smiling as if he already had a plan. "I know you need to clear your head," he said, raising the map as if it were a magical solution. "Let's go to the woods. It's beautiful out there, and you haven't had fresh air in a while." I looked at him with hesitation. The idea of getting out of the house was appealing, but the thought of Adam possibly taking it the wrong way made me pause. "Adam," I began, but Vince interrupted. "Adam's busy. Besides, I don't see anything wrong with this. We'll just walk, you'll come back, and everything will be fine. Right?" His confidence was contagious. Half an hour later, we were driving his old truck toward the nearest forest. The woods were magical. Tall trees let the sunlight filter through their leaves, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor covered in golden foliage. In the distance, a stream bubbled cheerfully. We walked along a trail, talking about all sorts of things, but the conversations felt meaningful, as though each one revealed something new about myself. "When I was a kid, I used to come here alone," Vince said when we stopped by a small wooden bridge over the stream. "This was my place, a spot where I could just be myself. I think everyone needs a place like that, somewhere you don't have to pretend." I thought about it. I didn't have a place like that, or if I once had, I'd long since forgotten it. "Do you have a place like that?" he asked, turning to me. "Probably not," I admitted. "The past few years, I've been so focused on work, on relationships. I think I've forgotten who I am." "That's normal," he said. "We all lose ourselves sometimes. The important thing is finding a way back." We continued walking. At one point, Vince stopped by a large tree and smiled. "You know why I love the woods?" he said. "It's simple here. No rules telling you who to be. You just breathe, listen, and start to understand what really matters." I couldn't help but smile. His words, his ease, and his honesty filled me with an unusual sense of calm. "You're too tied up in your life," he said, bending to pick up a fallen leaf. "Leave something for yourself. In the end, no one can make you live a life you don't want." When we got back to the truck, I felt different. It was as if the walk through the woods had lifted something heavy off my shoulders. Vince sat quietly behind the wheel, giving me space to process my thoughts. On the way home, I stared out the window, watching the trees pass by like frames from an old film. Inside me, a strange feeling began to grow. Maybe I was too tied up. Maybe I had forgotten what it meant to feel free. When we returned home, Adam was already sitting in the living room, his feet propped on the coffee table, eyes glued to his phone. Vince, as usual, offered a brief, "Thanks for the company," with a smile before heading upstairs. I stood in the doorway watching my husband. He didn't even look up to ask where I had been. My footsteps echoed softly through the quiet house. I closed the bedroom door behind me and walked to the window, staring out at the yard where the wind stirred the golden leaves. My mind was filled with memories of the walk with Vince, his words and the sense of lightness I hadn't felt in so long. Vince seemed alive, vibrant, while my life with Adam increasingly resembled an old photograph, faded and lifeless. Turning around, my eyes landed on Adam's belongings. His watch neatly placed on the nightstand, a shirt draped over the chair. All these little details, once symbols of our shared life, now felt foreign, weighed down with a sense of detachment. That evening, I avoided Adam. We exchanged a few words over dinner, but that was all. His tone lacked interest, concern, or even a hint of curiosity about the tension between us, and I could no longer pretend that this emptiness didn't bother me. Late at night, I found myself standing at the window again, staring out at the starless sky. My thoughts flitted back and forth like birds trapped in a cage. I knew I had to make a choice. Staying with Adam meant preserving stability, familiarity, but losing more and more of myself. Leaving? That felt like leaping into the unknown, and it wasn't the idea itself that scared me, but the aftermath. What if I was wrong? What if I destroyed everything and ended up with nothing? My thoughts kept circling back to Vince. His ease, his conviction that taking risks was worthwhile. All of it both inspired and unsettled me. Being with him, even entertaining the thought, felt wrong. But at the same time, it pulsed deep within me like a forbidden impulse I couldn't entirely suppress. At some point, I realized that I couldn't keep lying to myself. I was trapped in my own life, and I needed to either break free from this cage or accept that it would be my home forever. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts swirled and crashed against each other like waves in a storm. The next day began with yet another petty argument with Adam. This time, it was about something as trivial as who would handle the cleaning. His irritation was so familiar it no longer caused pain or anger, just exhaustion. Late that evening, Vince asked me to drive him home again. We rode in silence. The car sped along the deserted streets, the headlights carving out fleeting shapes of trees and houses from the darkness. When we stopped in front of his house, Vince didn't get out right away. He sat there with his hands resting on his knees, staring ahead for a few moments. Then, he turned to me, his expression serious yet gentle. "I know this shouldn't have gone this far," he began, his voice low and rough. "But I can't ignore it anymore." He leaned in closer, and when his lips met mine, it felt like a flash of light in the darkness, like taking a breath after being underwater for too long. It happened. When we pulled apart, the silence in the car grew even heavier. "I'm sorry," he said, leaning back into his seat. "I know how this looks, but I couldn't help myself." When I got home, Adam was already asleep. I stood in the darkened bedroom, staring at his silhouette, and tried to make sense of what I had done. The next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, Adam was already there. He was scrolling through his phone with one hand while holding a mug of coffee in the other. His usual morning silence had always seemed natural to me, but today the air was heavy with tension that couldn't be ignored. I knew that everything was about to come out. And it did. He placed his phone down on the table and, without looking at me, said, "Can you explain what this means?" I froze. In his hands was my phone. The screen was unlocked and a message from Vince was open. "Thanks for last night. You mean so much to me." The room spun as if time had stopped. This was the moment I had feared, the one I had known was inevitable. "Adam, I began, but he raised a hand to stop me. "I just want the truth," he said quietly, but his voice carried a weight of pain. "What's going on between you two?" His directness shattered any chance I had to formulate an excuse. I couldn't lie anymore, to him or to myself. "I don't know how to explain it," I said, my voice trembling. I'm confused. Adam, we've lost our connection. I've felt so alone, and with Vince, everything just feels different." "Different?" He let out a bitter laugh, finally looking up at me. "So that's it? You found someone else? Someone who makes it easier for you and you think that solves everything?" "No," I said, the weight of my words growing heavier with each one. "It's not about him. It's about us. We've become strangers to each other. I've tried for so long to find a way back to what we had, but, Adam, it's gone. It's just gone." He stood, placing his mug in the sink with sharp, deliberate movements. Then he turned to face me, his expression a mix of anger and deep hurt. "I always knew this could happen," he said, his voice cold. "You were never happy with me. Maybe I just couldn't give you what you needed." "It's not your fault," I whispered. "It's mutual. We both let this happen. We both stopped trying." He shook his head as if my words were meaningless. "You know," he said, grabbing his jacket from the hook, "if you want a new life so badly, you can have it. But don't think for a second that it'll be that simple. You made your choice. Now live with it." He slammed the door on his way out, leaving me alone in the kitchen. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, the pain overwhelming. But beneath the pain, there was also a strange sense of relief. This was the end of something that had long ceased to be real. In that moment, I realized this confrontation had been unavoidable. All that was left was to accept the consequences and find the strength to move forward. After Adam left, the house was enveloped in a deafening silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging my knees, staring at the wall. This was the point of no return. No false hopes, no pretense. It was over. I felt neither relief nor dread, just a strange, dull calmness. In the days that followed, I packed my belongings and moved into a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space was minuscule, barely fitting a bed, a table, and a few shelves, but it was mine. It was a new beginning. I tried not to think about Vince, about that kiss or his words. He hadn't reappeared. Before leaving, he sent a brief message. "I'm sorry for how things turned out. I hope you find what you're looking for." Then he moved to another city, where a new project awaited him. At first, I grappled with whether his departure was a betrayal or a sign that I needed to face things on my own. Over time, I stopped wondering. After all, it had been my choice, and I had to learn to live with it. The first weeks in the new apartment felt strange. The silence was unsettling, but within it, I began to hear my own thoughts. I spent hours walking through the city, exploring it in a way I never had before. I started cooking meals I'd always wanted to try but had kept putting off. I picked up drawing again, an old hobby from school days that now became a way to express myself. Slowly, the world began to come alive. I found joy in simple things: a hot cup of coffee in the morning, sunlight streaming onto the walls, the sounds of the city outside my window. I started noticing the people around me, their smiles, their hurried movements, their fleeting moments of happiness. When I thought about Vince, it wasn't with pain or regret, but with gratitude. He had been a catalyst, a person who showed me that life could be different. But he wasn't the answer. The answer had always been within me. One morning, as sunlight poured through the window, I woke up with a realization. I was no longer afraid of being alone. It was the most important discovery of all. My happiness didn't depend on anyone else. It lay in my desire to live, to explore, to rediscover myself. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but I faced the future without fear. Life once again felt like a canvas full of possibilities, and I was ready to paint on it. The thought warmed me in a way nothing else could. I smiled and took the first step into my new day. Several months passed. My old life felt like a distant memory, like scenes from a film I had watched long ago without much attachment. My new reality had become familiar, though it still left room for surprises and discoveries.